Something unexpected is happening in the world of country music, and it's not just about a new album or a surprise concert announcement. Keith Urban, one of the industry's most celebrated figures, has been undergoing a transformation so significant that fans and observers alike are struggling to understand what's really going on behind the scenes. The changes started subtly, a shift here, an unexpected announcement there. But as months have passed, these aren't random adjustments anymore. They form a pattern that tells a much larger story about reinvention, personal evolution, and the pressures that come with living life in the public eye. On the surface, Keith Urban has always appeared to have it all figured out. He's won Grammys, countless CMA awards, and established himself as one of the most technically gifted guitarists in modern music. His career trajectory reads like a masterclass in perseverance. Yet beneath that polished exterior, there's a narrative of constant change, strategic decisions, and a man who seems to be consciously redefining who he is and what he wants from life. Understanding this transformation requires looking back at where he came from, the obstacles he overcame, and the fundamental shifts happening in his world right now. Keith Urban's story doesn't begin on a stage in Nashville or with a record deal waiting in the wings. It begins in struggle, in a household where resources were scarce and emotional connection was even scarcer. Born in New Zealand in 1967, Keith's early years were shaped by the decisions his parents made to find better opportunities. The move to Australia, specifically to Brisbane, was supposed to offer hope and stability. What it delivered was something far more complicated. His parents operated a small convenience store, a business that demanded everything from them. The family lived literally behind the store, crammed into a tight space where the boundaries between work and home life dissolved completely. Accounts from people close to the family paint a picture of genuine hardship, not the kind that makes for compelling documentary fodder, but the real, grinding kind that shapes how a person sees themselves and the world. There were days when the family depended on community support just to get by. What makes this beginning particularly significant isn't just the financial struggle, but the emotional landscape. Keith's father battled alcoholism, a disease that cast a shadow over every interaction within the home. The household was marked by an absence of warmth, a lack of the kind of emotional intimacy that children need to develop a healthy sense of self-worth. When discipline came, it often crossed into something harder, physical punishment delivered without explanation or love. These weren't the kinds of moments that get discussed openly at family dinner tables. They're the kind that get buried, internalized, and carried forward into adulthood as invisible wounds. In an environment like that, most children develop coping mechanisms. Keith's became music. His father's passion for country music created an unexpected bridge, a place where connection could actually happen. Country songs were the language they shared when words couldn't be found. This connection to music wasn't incidental. It was survival. When Keith received his first ukulele at age 4, he was holding something far more valuable than an instrument. He was holding a key to a different kind of life. At 5 years old, Keith saw Johnny Cash perform, and something awakened inside him. The spark didn't fade with time. It grew. By 7, he had picked up a guitar and started performing whenever he could. Talent shows, local events, anywhere that would let him play. This wasn't a child dabbling in a hobby. This was a young person who had already decided his future, even though he was years away from understanding what that decision would demand of him. By age 9, he'd landed a spot on an Australian television show called Pot of Gold. For a child that age, this was a significant achievement, the kind of moment that could have launched a career or solidified his confidence in his abilities. Instead, what happened was something more formative, though not in a positive way. A judge named Bernard King delivered a critique that was meant to push Keith toward real music rather than country. The dismissal of his chosen genre, the questioning of his ability, the suggestion that his path was somehow less worthy than others, these words landed hard. But something remarkable happened in that moment of criticism. Rather than accepting the verdict, Keith focused on a single word the judge had used, intrinsically. When he asked his mother what it meant and learned it signified natural talent, he held on to that. He discarded the rest of the criticism and kept moving forward. This pattern, taking what's useful and discarding what isn't, would become characteristic of how Keith approached obstacles throughout his life. Just a year later, at 10 years old, Keith's home burned down completely. By extraordinary fortune, no one was inside when it happened, but the loss was total and devastating. Walking back into that house afterward, everything was destroyed. The normalcy of that morning was erased. Yet what stayed with Keith wasn't the trauma of the loss, though that was certainly present. What stayed with him was how the community responded. Neighbors arrived with clothes, food, and shelter. Organizations worked to help. In the midst of loss, Keith saw something about human connection that his own home had never provided, people showing up for each other in the worst moments. By his teenage years, Keith had made a decision that would have shocked most parents. He wanted to leave school behind and pursue music full-time. At 15, he sat down with his mother and laid out his case. He was already capable of playing multiple nights a week, earning money, and gaining real experience. This wasn't a phase or a passing interest. This was his future, and he needed to pursue it now while he had the energy and the window of opportunity to do so. His mother, against what conventional wisdom would suggest, agreed. This decision changed everything about Keith's trajectory. He threw himself into the Brisbane music scene with the kind of intensity that only comes from someone who has no backup plan, no safety net, no alternative future. He played in bars and clubs, sometimes performing for hours at a time. He adapted his repertoire constantly, playing whatever the crowd wanted to hear. He was learning the craft not in a classroom or through a progressive recording deal, but in real time, in front of real audiences who would let him know immediately if he was succeeding or failing. By 1991, Keith released his self-titled debut album in Australia through EMI. It wasn't a global phenomenon, but it resonated with country music fans in his home country. More importantly, it led to an opportunity that felt almost miraculous. He was invited to open for Slim Dusty, one of the most respected figures in Australian country music. Years earlier, Keith had been just another kid waiting in line to get Slim's autograph. Now he was sharing a stage with him. During that tour, something happened that would shift Keith's perspective on performance forever. When Keith mentioned there were only a few shows left, expressing relief that the tour was ending, Slim responded differently than expected. Rather than celebrating the finish line, Slim grew quiet and reflective. He talked about how few chances remained to connect with audiences, how each show was a gift that shouldn't be taken for granted. That conversation stuck with Keith. It forced him to recognize that he had already started taking the stage for granted, treating it as a checkbox rather than a privilege. That shift in perspective would inform how he approached his career moving forward. In 1992, Keith made the leap to Nashville, Tennessee, the epicenter of country music. The city felt right almost immediately, but feeling right and finding success are entirely different things. Breaking into the Nashville scene proved tougher than anything he'd faced before. Years of grinding it out followed. He formed a band called The Ranch, signed with Capitol Records, and released an album in 1997 that was supposed to be the breakthrough. It wasn't. Life on the road with The Ranch became exhausting and demoralizing. They traveled in a worn-out van to small venues with minimal audiences. The momentum stalled. The experience drained him in ways that went beyond professional frustration. During this period, something darker was taking root. Beneath the ambition and the talent, Keith was struggling with deep insecurity and a constant fear of failure. On stage, he felt powerful and in control. Off stage, he felt like he didn't belong anywhere. That internal conflict created an opening for something much more dangerous. During a vulnerable moment early in his Nashville years, Keith was introduced to cocaine. What started as a single decision slowly became a habit, then became something far more consuming. The addiction wasn't just chemical, it was emotional, a way of managing the disconnection he felt from everything around him. A breakup intensified the spiral. He leaned harder into drinking and drugs, trying to escape the weight of everything he was feeling. By the late 1990s, Keith's addiction had reached a crisis point. He was living in rundown spaces, staying up through entire nights, completely lost in the cycle of chasing highs and crashing. The contradiction of his life became almost surreal, performing on stage one night with professional competence, then disappearing into days of heavy drug use the next. He was barely holding it together, and the gap between the person he was presenting to the world and the person he was becoming in private was growing unbridgeable. By 1998, Keith reached a point where something had to change. The spiral had gone too far, and for the first time, he made a conscious decision to step away from it. He checked himself into rehab, a move that required admitting failure, vulnerability, and the possibility that the life he'd been building was unsustainable. Rehabilitation wasn't just about breaking addiction. It was about fundamentally reshaping how he saw himself and his place in the world. One moment from his time in treatment stayed with him. A counselor explained that life isn't about getting everything perfectly right. It's about trying to move in the right direction. It's about understanding that no one walks perfectly in the light, but the goal is to keep leaning toward it. For someone like Keith, who had internalized the message that he deserved punishment and pain from his childhood, this reframing was revolutionary. It gave him permission to be imperfect while still moving forward. After rehab, Keith emerged with a clarity he hadn't possessed before. His songwriting began to stand out. Artists like the Chicks recorded his work. The industry started to recognize that while his band had failed, Keith himself had something special. Capitol Records gave him another shot, this time as a solo artist. In 1999, he released his American debut album, and this time, things felt different. The project connected in ways his earlier work hadn't. Songs gained real traction, and But for the Grace of God became his first #1 hit in the United States. What made that moment even more significant was the context. Years earlier, he had released an album in Australia that barely made a ripple. This time, there was no doubt. The American debut exploded, going platinum within months. As the new millennium began, Keith Urban had genuinely arrived. Yet this was only the beginning of what was coming next. In 2005, Keith met Nicole Kidman at a Good Day USA gala in Los Angeles. On paper, they looked like the perfect match, both Australian-raised, both built from humble beginnings, both driven by the demands of their respective industries. Nicole felt the connection immediately and was open about her interest. Keith, true to form, was guarded. His hesitation stretched for 4 months. He had her number but couldn't bring himself to call it. The fear of rejection outweighed everything else. When he finally pushed past it, things moved quickly. By June 2005, on Nicole's 38th birthday, Keith showed up outside her New York apartment at 5 a.m. with a bouquet of gardenias. It was simple and sincere, without grandeur or pretense. For Nicole, that was the moment everything clicked. A year later, they married in Sydney in a wedding that brought together industry heavyweights and felt like the beginning of something stable and permanent. But the marriage faced immediate challenges. Just 4 months after the wedding, Keith checked into rehab for alcohol abuse. He had relapsed after years of sobriety. The isolation had gotten to him, and old habits had crept back in. To his credit, he didn't hide from it. He faced it head-on, admitted the damage it caused, and acknowledged that his actions nearly destroyed the marriage before it even had a real chance to develop. Nicole stood by him, and they worked through it together. Over the following years, they built a family. They welcomed daughters Sunday Rose in 2008 and Faith Margaret in 2010. Fatherhood became another turning point for Keith. Coming from a household without emotional warmth, raising 2 daughters was unfamiliar territory, but he embraced it fully. What started as uncertainty gradually transformed into something more stable. Yet beneath the surface, things were never quite as seamless as they appeared. In 2014, during an interview on Live with Kelly and Michael, Keith described living in a household dominated by strong, creative women. He used words like lively and loud, but the underlying tone suggested something more intense and sometimes overwhelming. Nicole later revealed that she would sometimes find Keith retreated in a closet, guitar in hand, trying